In early 1968, after the Tet Offensive, the war in South Vietnam entered a new phase. Although the assaults on major cities failed to achieve their decisive military objectives, the People's Army of Vietnam continued to increase pressure along the border regions and mountainous areas, forcing the United States to disperse its forces in order to defend its network of forward bases and strategic supply routes. One of the main focal points of the confrontation was the Vietnam-Laos border region within I Corps Tactical Zone. This area held exceptional strategic importance, as numerous supply routes branching from the Ho Chi Minh Trail extended toward Quang Nam and the Central Highlands. To maintain surveillance over this region, the United States established Kham Duc Camp in Phuoc Son District, Quang Tin Province, now Phuoc Son District, Quang Nam Province. Situated in a narrow valley, surrounded by rugged mountains and dense jungle, and almost entirely dependent on air resupply, Kham Duc became one of the most isolated American bases in central South Vietnam. By early May 1968, as People's Army of Vietnam activity around the area intensified, the approaches to the base came under constant threat, and the first signs of encirclement began to emerge. Within just a few days, the small base in the mountains of western Quang Tin would become the center of the Battle of Kham Duc, a battle that led to one of the most complex and dramatic aerial evacuations ever carried out by the U.S. military during the Vietnam War. Before Kham Duc itself could be threatened, the People's Army of Vietnam first had to eliminate the outer defensive screen protecting the base. About 5 kilometers south of Kham Duc stood the Ngok Tavak outpost, a small strongpoint tasked with guarding the most critical approach to the camp. Its defenders consisted of U.S. Special Forces advisors, CIDG troops, several Australian personnel, and a U.S. Marine artillery detachment equipped with two 105mm howitzers. Isolated deep in the mountains and entirely dependent on helicopter resupply, Ngok Tavak became the first objective selected by the attacking force to open the way toward Kham Duc. At approximately 3:15 a.m. on May 10, the battle for Ngok Tavak began. Under the cover of darkness, a group of CIDG soldiers approached the perimeter from outside, calling out to the guards not to open fire as they advanced. Once close enough, they threw grenades and opened fire on the defensive positions. Almost simultaneously, mortars, rockets, and small arms fire from the south and west struck the outpost. At the command post, Captain John J. White, commander of U.S. Special Forces Detachment, A-105, together with his American and Australian advisors, quickly directed the CIDG defenders into their fighting positions. The first rounds landed around the command post, the artillery position, and the troop quarters. Electrical power was cut. Smoke and dirt poured into the trenches. Exploiting gaps in the perimeter wire, the assault elements rapidly closed in on the two 105mm howitzers. The Marine artillerymen no longer had enough time to employ their guns in the conventional manner. Some lowered the barrels and fired directly at the attackers ahead of them, while others fought from their positions with rifles, machine guns, and grenades. Within a short time, the defensive line at Ngok Tavak had been fragmented into several isolated pockets. One bunker remained in the hands of the defenders, while a trench only a few dozen meters away had already been overrun. Firefights erupted at extremely close range. Grenades were thrown across sections of trench. Several positions came under attack from the rear after breaches had been opened in the perimeter. Evacuating the wounded to the aid station became virtually impossible. An incoming round struck the artillery ammunition storage area, setting part of the stockpile ablaze. The flames illuminated the defensive positions, while making anyone moving in the open an easy target. The attacking force continued to pour troops through the breaches in the perimeter, using explosives and automatic weapons fire to press closer to the command post. The two 105mm howitzers continued firing until their remaining ammunition was nearly exhausted. Overhead, an AC-47 arrived and began firing on designated targets. However, by this point, many positions inside the outpost had already been overrun, and the lines separating the two sides had become impossible to distinguish. The defenders were forced to request airstrikes against sections of their own position that had just been lost, even though wounded men or isolated soldiers might still have been trapped there. At first light, Captain White organized a local counterattack to retake the center of the outpost. The CIDG troops and their advisors succeeded in driving several enemy groups out of bunkers near the command post, but they lacked the manpower to restore the entire perimeter. The People's Army of Vietnam continued to hold the eastern sector of the outpost, from where it dominated the landing zone and the main avenues of movement. Helicopters were dispatched to evacuate the wounded and bring in reinforcements, but the landing zone was already under direct fire. As CH-46 helicopters descended, machine guns on the surrounding hillsides opened fire simultaneously. 2 helicopters were hit and disabled on the landing zone, effectively blocking nearly the entire usable area. Another medevac helicopter attempted to land, but as soon as it touched down, numerous CIDG soldiers rushed toward it in disorder. The aircraft was forced to take off overloaded, with some men still clinging to the outside. By mid-morning, the situation had become beyond recovery. The 2 howitzers were nearly out of ammunition. The landing zone was blocked. 7. Part of the perimeter had fallen under enemy control, while the defenders had no clear idea how many opposing units were assembling in the surrounding jungle. Captain John J. White decided to withdraw all remaining personnel from Ngok Tavak before the outpost was completely encircled. The artillery pieces were disabled. Equipment that could not be carried was destroyed. The remaining ammunition stockpile was set on fire. Those still able to move formed a withdrawal column, carrying the wounded and salvaging some communications equipment. Rather than taking the direct route back to Kham Duc, believing the trails had already been ambushed, they turned southeast, crossed a river, and pushed deeper into the jungle. Strike aircraft attacked suspected enemy positions to conceal the direction of the withdrawal. Moving through the jungle, the column helped the wounded across steep slopes while maintaining intervals to avoid detection. After covering more than a kilometer, they halted on a hilltop, cut down trees, and cleared a temporary landing zone. Helicopters later arrived to extract the survivors in several lifts. By the evening of May 10, most of those who had withdrawn from Ngok Tavak had been evacuated to Kham Duc. According to U.S. reports, the Battle of Ngok Tavak left 15 American personnel dead, more than 50 members of the defending force wounded, and dozens missing, most of them CIDG soldiers. Some bodies could not be recovered. The 2 105mm howitzers were destroyed before the withdrawal. Several helicopters were damaged or abandoned, and the Ngok Tavak outpost fell completely into the hands of the People's Army of Vietnam, opening the way for a direct assault on Kham Duc. Throughout May 10 and 11, U.S. forces continued to reinforce Kham Duc by sea. 130 transport aircraft. Artillery, ammunition, and supplies were rapidly moved from the airstrip to the defensive positions. However, the newly arrived troops had to deploy across a wide perimeter, while the dominant high ground surrounding the valley remained outside the base's control. Mortar and recoilless rifle bombardments continued almost without interruption. Whenever transport aircraft appeared, enemy fire concentrated on the airfield. The units that had withdrawn from Ngok Tavak brought back numerous wounded and reported that the People's Army of Vietnam had already reached the perimeter, controlled the main approaches, and dominated many of the areas that could be used as helicopter landing zones. On May 11, the U.S. Air Force launched multiple B-52 strikes against the area between Ngok Tavak and Kham Duc. Hundreds of tons of bombs were dropped on locations suspected of sheltering People's Army of Vietnam forces. The valley shook under the bombardment, and thick clouds of smoke and dust covered the surrounding hillsides. But the actual results were difficult to determine. The opposing units had dispersed into the jungle and continued closing in on the base. After the bombing ended, mortar fire continued to fall on the airstrip. Later that day, the U.S. command concluded that Kham Duc could no longer be defended for an extended period. Unlike Khe Sanh, the base lacked defense in depth, did not control the surrounding high ground, and depended almost entirely on air resupply. General William C. Westmoreland approved the withdrawal plan and assigned the American Division to carry it out. Before dawn on May 12, the Special Forces Detachment at Kham Duc received orders to prepare for the complete evacuation of the base. However, the order was not fully communicated to all units and flight crews. Some aircraft continued flying toward Kham Duc on reinforcement or resupply missions, while the evacuation plan still lacked coordinated control between the ground forces, helicopters, and transport aircraft. During the final hours of the night of May 11 and into the early morning of May 12, the People's Army of Vietnam launched simultaneous attacks against the outposts on the high ground surrounding the valley. One position after another was encircled or overrun. Some defending units were forced to call for artillery and AC-47 gunships to fire directly onto their own defensive positions to prevent the attackers from closing in. By daybreak, most of the outer observation posts were no longer in the hands of the defenders. At approximately 6:30 a.m. on May 12, the aerial evacuation of Kham Duc officially began. CH-47 Chinooks, CH-46 Sea Knights, and UH-1 Hueys entered the base one after another to evacuate the wounded CIDG personnel and American troops. Armed helicopters flew low along the surrounding hillsides to suppress enemy fire, while forward air controllers directed F-4 Phantom II, F-100 Super Sabre, and A-1 Skyraider strike aircraft against newly identified targets. The airspace over Kham Duc quickly became overcrowded. Transport aircraft, helicopters, and combat aircraft were forced to operate simultaneously within a narrow valley under intense anti-aircraft fire. Each aircrew had only a few minutes to approach, land, load passengers, and depart the area. At approximately 7:30 a.m., a CH-47 was hit by enemy fire and disabled on the runway, blocking operations for fixed-wing transport aircraft. Combat engineers had to move under artillery fire to clear the wreck from the airstrip. Only after the runway had been temporarily reopened were C-130 transport aircraft able to land one by one. At 9:35 a.m., the People's Army of Vietnam launched a major assault against the southeastern sector of the base. Infantry advanced to the perimeter under the cover of mortar fire and automatic weapons. U.S. artillery fired directly from within the base, while strike aircraft attacked targets only a few dozen meters from the defensive line. The first assault was repulsed, but another quickly developed on the opposite side. Multiple People's Army of Vietnam assault teams reached the perimeter at several points, making the use of airstrikes increasingly difficult as the distance between the two sides became too close. At 10 a.m. on May 12, the 1st C-130, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Cole, landed at Kham Duc. The aircraft suffered a blown tire and damage to its fuel tank during the approach. After taking passengers aboard, the crew was forced to abort its first takeoff attempt because the aircraft failed to reach sufficient speed. For nearly 2 hours, they repaired the aircraft on the runway under intermittent mortar fire before finally managing to fly it out of the valley. Shortly afterward, a C-123 landed briefly to pick up a combat engineer unit before taking off immediately. However, by the end of the morning, most of the American personnel and CIDG troops at the base had still not been evacuated. At approximately 2:30 p.m., a C-130 piloted by Major Bernard Bucher approached Kham Duc. The aircraft landed successfully, but shortly after takeoff, it flew into the field of fire of heavy machine guns positioned on the high ground to the north. Multiple bursts tore through the fuselage and wings, causing the aircraft to lose control before crashing into a ravine less than 2 kilometers from the end of the runway. The entire flight crew and everyone aboard were killed. Forward air controllers quickly identified the positions of the machine guns that had opened fire. strike aircraft immediately attacked those firing positions to clear the way for the following evacuation flights. Lieutenant Colonel William Boyd brought his C-130 toward Kham Duc. After being forced to wave off once because of the intense ground fire, he decided to make another attempt, landed successfully, evacuated more than 100 people, and took off safely despite his aircraft being struck by numerous rounds. Another C-130, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Delmore, also landed successfully, but sustained such severe damage from ground fire that it could no longer take off. The crew was forced to abandon the aircraft and was later rescued from the base by helicopter. After 4 p.m., the last C-130 flights landed one after another to evacuate the remaining units from Kham Duc. The final aircraft carried out the Special Forces Detachment, the CIDG commanding officers, and the last American personnel to leave the base. In total, more than 1,400 American personnel and CIDG troops were evacuated from Kham Duc by C-130S, C-123S, and helicopters. During the operation, 2 C-130S were destroyed, several other aircraft were hit or heavily damaged, and a number of helicopters were either shot down or abandoned on the battlefield. However, the evacuation was still not entirely complete. At approximately 4:20 p.m., due to a communications error, 3 members of an Air Force combat control team were inadvertently flown back into Kham Duc aboard a C-130 after most of the garrison had already been evacuated. Upon landing, they discovered that the command post and defensive positions had already been abandoned. The C-130 that had brought them in was forced to take off immediately under enemy fire. The 3 men remained behind, taking cover in the trenches while attempting to signal the aircraft operating overhead. Late in the afternoon of May 12, a C-123 piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Joe Jackson landed as strike aircraft suppressed enemy positions on both sides of the runway. The 3 combat control team members quickly boarded the aircraft, and the C-123 immediately departed Kham Duc. It was the final flight to leave the base. As the last American aircraft departed the valley, the People's Army of Vietnam moved into the Special Forces compound, the artillery positions, and the airfield. Many defensive positions were still burning. Engineer vehicles, ammunition, communications equipment, helicopter wreckage, and a disabled C-130 were left scattered around the runway. Some equipment had been destroyed before the withdrawal, but there had not been enough time to disable the entire base. The following day, B-52 bombers and tactical aircraft continued striking the Kham Duc area to destroy the remaining equipment and prevent the opposing force from making immediate use of the airfield. Nevertheless, the base had passed completely out of American control. At the conclusion of the battle, the United States and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam suffered significant losses in both personnel and equipment, according to U.S. records. The Battle of Ngok Tavak alone claimed the lives of 15 American servicemen, left more than 50 members of the defending force wounded, and resulted in dozens of CIDG soldiers being listed as missing. During the overall Battle of Kham Duc, from May 10 to 12, 1,968 U.S. forces suffered approximately 40 killed, more than 100 wounded, and the loss or damage of numerous aircraft. The People's Army of Vietnam did not release casualty figures, while U.S. estimates have yet to be independently verified. From a tactical standpoint, the People's Army of Vietnam achieved its objectives. Ngok Tavak was overrun. The high ground surrounding the valley was secured, and Kham Duc was abandoned, eliminating an important American forward base in western Quang Tin province. For the United States, the evacuation succeeded in saving most of the garrison from encirclement, but it also exposed shortcomings in command and coordination between ground forces and air support. At the same time, the battle demonstrated the decisive importance of air transport as helicopters C-123S and C-123 130s succeeded in evacuating most of the defending force despite direct enemy fire. The Battle of Kham Duc was not the largest engagement of the Vietnam War, but it marked the first time the United States was forced to abandon a major base through a complete air evacuation. The battle demonstrated that even a heavily supported forward base could become impossible to hold once it was isolated in rugged, mountainous terrain and lost control of the surrounding high ground.